In 1953, a retired coal miner in eastern Kentucky survived an entire winter on $9 a week for food. He made the same pot of something every single evening, washed the dish, and did it again the next night for 2 full years. His daughter said he never once complained about eating the same thing. That meal is number 4 on this list, and he learned it from watching his mother cook during the worst years of the Depression. Number 18 on this list costs less than $1.50 at any grocery store in America. Number 9 was created by a woman in Nebraska who couldn't stand long enough to manage 2 burners at once, so she figured out how to use just one. These 25 meals share a single purpose: keeping people alive. They filled the bellies of men and women eating alone at kitchen tables that once seated entire families. They stretched Social Security checks across 30 days when the math barely worked. Hit that subscribe button. Let's count down the 25 forgotten poor man one-pot meals for seniors living alone. Number 25. Tomato and bread soup. There are meals that say, "I have almost nothing," and then there are meals that say, "I have almost nothing, and I am still going to eat like I matter." This was the second kind. A senior with half a stale loaf and a can of crushed tomatoes could pull together a supper that tasted like it came from a kitchen in the Italian countryside. You tore the bread into rough pieces, dropped them into a pot with the tomatoes, a clove of garlic, and enough water to bring it all together, and let it simmer for 20 minutes. The bread slowly dissolved into the liquid, thickening it into a dense, warming porridge. A little salt, a splash of whatever oil was on hand. Nothing more. Italian immigrants carried this into tenement apartments in New York and Philadelphia in the 1940s, and it spread through every neighborhood where people knew what it meant to count pennies. Seniors who grew up in those neighborhoods made it on nights when the cupboard held almost nothing, and the energy to cook held even less. One pot, one burner, 15 minutes upright, and a full stomach by 7 o'clock. Food writers eventually found it, renamed it Ribollita, and put it on restaurant menus for $18 a bowl. Your grandmother just called it dinner. Number 24. Potato and onion stew. If you came up poor in Appalachia, you did not need a cookbook. You needed 2 potatoes, 1 onion, a knob of butter or a spoonful of bacon grease, water, and salt. That was the whole list. You sliced the potatoes thin, diced the onion into rough pieces, put everything in a pot, and let it simmer until the potatoes broke apart and turned the water into something thick and creamy without a single drop of cream in sight. The bacon grease was the soul of it. It added a low smokiness that made the whole thing taste far richer than the ingredients had any right to produce. For a senior on a fixed income, this was a Tuesday night salvation. Potatoes were cheap. Onions lasted weeks in a cool cabinet. The whole thing could be made seated on a kitchen stool without lifting anything heavier than a wooden spoon. Churchwomen in West Virginia still carry this in mason jars to homebound neighbors. It reheats the next day without losing a thing. Number 23. Ham bone and bean soup. The households that understood hunger did not throw anything away. Once the Sunday ham was eaten down past the point of slicing, the bone went into the refrigerator with a purpose. That bone became the foundation of the next 3 days. A senior would drop it into a pot alongside a bag of dried navy beans soaked the night before, a rough-cut onion, a couple of carrots, and enough water to cover everything by a couple of inches. Then it simmered. 3 hours, sometimes 4, until the beans turned creamy and the broth coaxed every last trace of smoke and salt from that bone. By the time it was ready, the line between broth and bean had completely disappeared. The soup was thick enough to hold a spoon in place. A bag of navy beans cost 69 cents in 1990 and fed 1 person for the better part of a week. The ham bone cost nothing. It had already been paid for at Sunday's table. This was arithmetic. This was the practical wisdom of women who had never once been able to afford waste. Number 22. Cabbage and Sausage Pot. 1 head of cabbage, 2 or 3 links of smoked sausage, a pot of water. That is the complete shopping list. You quartered the cabbage, sliced the sausage into thick rounds, put everything in the pot together, and let it go for 45 minutes. By the time it was done, the cabbage had gone silky and sweet, and the broth had taken on the deep garlic and smoke perfume of the sausage. A single head of cabbage cost less than $1 and stretched across 3 days of meals. Smoked sausage kept for weeks in the refrigerator without spoiling. For a senior with arthritis in the hands, this meal asked almost nothing. You could tear the cabbage apart without a knife. You could snap the sausage links without a cutting board. No technique, no strength, almost no money. Polish grandmothers in Chicago made it every week. German families in Wisconsin made it every winter. It crossed every ethnic line because poverty has never once cared about your heritage. Number 21. Rice and canned chicken stew. This was the meal you made when getting to a store was not possible. A can of chicken, a cup of rice, a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with water. Everything into one pot. 20 minutes, and you had something that tasted like a stripped-down chicken and rice casserole. Warm, filling, and genuinely comforting. Because the chicken was already cooked in the can, there was no handling of raw meat with unsteady hands, no worrying about internal temperatures or cross-contamination. You opened, you added, you stirred, you waited. In the 1970s and 1980s, this became the unofficial meal of rural seniors who lived far from the nearest grocery. They stocked their pantry shelves the way a prepper stocked a shelter, and meals like this could be assembled without a single fresh ingredient in the house. It was not beautiful, but it kept people fed and on their own terms, and that was the point entirely. Number 20. Chili with beans. Not the kind they judge at Texas competitions, with hand-trimmed brisket and dried chilies sourced from 3 different states. The real kind. A pound of ground beef browned in a pot, a can of kidney beans, a can of diced tomatoes, chili powder, and salt. 30 minutes start to finish, and you had a pot that tasted better on day 2 than it did the night you made it, and better still on day 3. For a senior cooking for one, this was the gold standard of batch cooking. Make it Sunday, eat it Monday through Wednesday without a single repeat visit to the stove. The beans made it filling, the tomatoes gave it life, and even the cheapest tube of ground beef from the markdown rack gave the whole thing a weight that kept you full until morning. Food banks knew this recipe the way a priest knows the Lord's Prayer. They packaged the ingredients together in single bags because they knew exactly who would be making it and exactly how far it would need to stretch. Number 19. Egg drop soup. Your grandmother did not need a restaurant for this. She needed a pot of simmering chicken broth, 2 eggs, and 60 seconds of attention. She brought the broth to a full boil, cracked the eggs into a cup, and beat them with a fork, then poured the eggs in a slow, thin stream while stirring in a wide circle. The eggs set immediately into soft, golden ribbons that drifted through the broth like silk. Salt, pepper, done. This was the meal for sick days, for exhausted evenings, for nights when the appetite was gone, but the body still needed something warm to hold on to. The broth hydrated, the eggs provided protein, and the whole thing went down gently, without effort. A carton of broth and 2 eggs came to less than $2. It took less than 5 minutes, and it delivered more genuine comfort than most things that take an hour to prepare. For someone eating alone in a quiet house, it was the closest thing to being taken care of that a kitchen could offer by itself. Number 17. Lentil and carrot stew. A cup of dried lentils, 2 carrots, an onion, and a pot of water. Depression-era mothers wrote this on index cards and pressed them into their daughters' hands when the time came to leave home. Lentils were different from other dried beans because they needed no overnight soaking. 30 minutes of simmering and they broke down into a thick, earthy stew that filled you in a way that stuck. The carrots added a low sweetness. The onion gave it foundation, and the entire pot cost less than $1, even well into the 1990s. Nutritionists today call lentils a superfood and point to their protein, fiber, iron, and folate content. Seniors who ate them for decades without knowing any of that science were quietly outperforming people spending 5 times as much on supplements at the pharmacy. A woman in Missouri told her church circle that she had made lentil stew 3 nights a week for 11 years after her husband died. Her doctor said her blood numbers were excellent. She said she was just following what her mother showed her. Number 16. Corn Chowder. A can of creamed corn, a can of whole kernel corn, 1 diced potato, and a cup of milk. That combination produced one of the simplest and most genuinely satisfying chowders in American cooking, and almost nobody makes it anymore. You simmered the potato in a small amount of water until it softened, added both cans of corn and the milk, and let everything come together over low heat until the soup thickened into a golden, sweet, velvety bowl. Some people crumbled a strip of bacon on top. Some added a little cayenne. But the base version needed nothing extra because the creamed corn functioned as its own thickener, eliminating any need for a roux or flour slurry. For a senior managing blood sugar, you could drop the potato entirely, and the soup was still dense enough to eat with a spoon. Midwestern farm women made this at the end of the growing season, when the garden was done and the freezer was running low. The canned corn had been sitting on the shelf for months, waiting for exactly this moment. Number 15. Black-Eyed Pea Stew. In the South, black-eyed peas were not only a New Year's tradition, they were a Wednesday night lifeline. A bag of dried black-eyed peas simmered alongside a ham hock, a rough-cut onion, and a can of diced tomatoes until the whole pot thickened into something smoky, slightly tangy, and deeply satisfying. The ham hock was the cheapest item in the butcher's case, often less than $1 a pound, and its entire purpose on this earth was to give flavor to beans. It performed that job better than anything else in the store. Seniors across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia made this at the start of the month when the check arrived, buying dried peas and ham hocks in quantities that would carry them through to the next one. A single pot fed one person for 4 or 5 days. Served over rice, it stretched further still. This was not cuisine in any formal sense. It was calculation. It was the applied mathematics of people who could not afford to get the numbers wrong. Number 14. 1 pot beef and macaroni. 1 pound of ground beef. 1 box of elbow macaroni. 1 can of tomato sauce. 1 pot. You browned the beef, drained the fat, added the pasta and sauce directly into the same pot with enough water for the macaroni to cook in. 15 minutes, and you had a meal that tasted like every casserole your mother ever pulled from the oven, simplified down to its essential form. Children loved it. Grandparents who cooked for grandchildren kept the ingredients on the shelf at all times. But the real revelation was for someone eating alone, because the leftovers reheated perfectly and actually improved overnight when the sauce soaked fully into the noodles. In American households of the 1960s and 1970s, this was called goulash, though it bore no real resemblance to the Hungarian dish it borrowed its name from. It was American poverty food wearing a European hat, and it kept millions of people fed without complaint or ceremony. Number 13. Chicken and Dumplings. A whole chicken cost $1.49 a pound in 1985, but the backs, necks, and wings cost almost nothing. A senior could spend $2 on bony chicken parts, drop them in a pot with water, celery, and onion, and simmer it all until the meat released completely from the bone. Then you pulled the bones out, dropped spoonfuls of biscuit dough directly into the simmering broth, covered the pot, and waited 20 minutes. The dumplings puffed up soft and dense, absorbing the chicken-rich broth as they cooked. What came out was tender shredded chicken, thick golden broth, and dumplings that dissolved on the tongue. This was the meal that Southern grandmothers carried to doorsteps in covered pots when someone on the street was grieving, sick, or had simply had too hard a week. For a senior cooking for one, a single batch lasted nearly a week. And every time you reheated a bowl, the kitchen smelled like someone had gone to the trouble of caring for you. Number 12. Split Pea Soup. A bag of dried split peas, a leftover ham bone, a carrot, and water. That was the full ingredient list, and nothing else was necessary. The peas cooked down in an hour into a thick green porridge so dense you could stand a spoon in it, while the ham bone surrendered every trace of smokiness it had left into the broth. In the 1950s and 1960s, this was cafeteria food across America. It was served in hospital kitchens, military mess halls, and senior centers because it was inexpensive, filling, and nearly impossible to ruin. You could walk away from the pot, get distracted, come back 20 minutes later, and find that nothing had burned. It had just gotten thicker. For a senior with memory concerns, that quality of forgiveness mattered in a practical and immediate way. An unattended pot did not become an emergency. It became tomorrow's lunch. The generation that lived through the Depression knew this soup the way they knew their birthdays. It was built into them. Number 11. Canned salmon patties in gravy. This one technically bends the one-pot rule, but the gravy came together in the same skillet the patties cooked in, so it counts. You mashed a can of salmon with a cracker or two, an egg, and a little diced onion, formed it into patties, fried them until golden on both sides, then pushed them to the edge of the pan. A little flour went into the drippings, milk went in over that, and you stirred until a gravy formed. The patties went back into the center, covered, and simmered for 5 minutes. A can of salmon cost less than $2. 2 patties and gravy served over rice or bread made 2 full meals for one person. The soft bones in canned salmon, which dissolve into the mix when you mash it, are rich in calcium. Doctors now specifically recommend it for seniors concerned about bone density. Your grandmother did not know the science behind it. She knew it was cheap, it held together in the pan, and it filled you up. That was the whole criteria. Number 10. Navy bean soup. If the ham bone and bean soup was the Sunday version, this was the weeknight workhorse. No bone required. A bag of dried navy beans, an onion, 2 stalks of celery, salt, and 2 hours of low simmering. The beans swelled and burst and turned the water into a creamy, pale broth that tasted far more layered than its ingredients suggested. Some people added a splash of vinegar at the end to cut through the richness. Some added a single bay leaf. The plain version worked perfectly well on its own. The United States Senate cafeteria has served navy bean soup every single day since 1903. Not as a novelty, as a tradition. Because it is cheap, it is filling, and every senator who grew up without money immediately recognized it as the taste of where they came from. For a senior, a 2-pound bag of dried navy beans cost $1.50 and produced a full week of meals. The math does not get better than that. Number 9. Tuna Noodle Pot. 1 can of tuna, a handful of egg noodles, a can of cream of mushroom soup, frozen peas if you had them in the freezer. Everything into one pot with enough water for the noodles to cook through. 12 minutes and your kitchen smelled like every Wednesday night from 1955 to 1985. Cream of mushroom soup was the quiet engine running underneath American home cooking for 4 decades. It transformed whatever it touched into something creamy and familiar and comforting without requiring any real technique. For a senior alone, this was the meal you made without measuring, without thinking, practically with your eyes closed. Open, dump, stir, wait. A woman in Nebraska who made her own version of this began adding a handful of crushed potato chips over her bowl before she ate. She said the crunch made her feel like she was having a real dinner instead of just surviving the evening. Her neighbors caught on. They started bringing their own chips when they visited. Then they started bringing their own bowls. A one-pot meal born from loneliness accidentally cured a little of it. Number 8. Potato soup. 5 potatoes, 1 onion, butter, milk, and salt. That list fed more American families through hard times than nearly any other combination of ingredients on this list. You peeled and diced everything, simmered it until the potatoes softened, then mashed a portion of them directly in the pot to thicken the broth. Milk and butter went in at the end. 30 minutes, less than $2, a full pot of something warm and genuinely satisfying. For seniors, potato soup had one quality that no other meal on this list could match quite as well. It was completely soft. There was nothing to chew. For someone with dental problems, missing teeth, or dentures that never fit right, this distinction was not about comfort or preference. It was the difference between eating a proper supper and quietly giving up on the meal entirely. The Depression generation did not speak openly about dental care because most of them never had access to it. They adapted their cooking instead, quietly shifting towards softer and softer foods until they found what worked. Potato soup sat at the center of that adaptation. Number 7. Sausage and white bean stew. Smoked sausage cut into rounds, a can of white beans drained and rinsed, a can of diced tomatoes, a handful of fresh spinach if it was in the refrigerator, though the stew worked completely without it. Everything into one pot, 20 minutes of simmering, and what came out looked and tasted like something worth sitting down for. The sausage gave it smoke. The beans gave it weight. The tomatoes cut through the richness with brightness. The spinach, if it was there, added iron that most seniors were not getting nearly enough of from the rest of their diet. But beyond the nutrition, this meal did something more important for some seniors than any vitamin could. It looked like a real dinner. It could be served in a proper bowl and eaten at the table and feel like a meal rather than just fuel. For a person beginning to lose interest in food, that psychological distinction mattered more than any label on a supplement bottle. Number 6. Vegetable beef soup. A pound of stew meat, whatever was in the vegetable drawer, a can of tomatoes, and water. This was the meal that used everything before it turned. Celery going limp at the edges, carrots starting to soften, half an onion left over from something else, a potato with eyes beginning to sprout. All of it went into the pot together after the stew meat had browned in the bottom. Then you covered it, turned it low, and waited an hour while the kitchen windows fogged and the broth slowly became something deeply savory and nourishing. For a senior managing a household alone, this meal solved a problem beyond hunger. It prevented food waste, which prevented the quiet shame of finding spoiled vegetables in the crisper drawer, which prevented the slow, eroding feeling that you were no longer managing your own life properly. Every pot was different from the last. No two batches tasted exactly the same. And that small, unpredictable variation made each bowl feel like its own thing, which kept the repetition from settling into monotony. Number 5. Red beans and rice. A pound of dried red kidney beans, a smoked sausage link, an onion, a bell pepper, a stalk of celery, simmered together on low heat for most of the afternoon, then spooned over rice. This was the Monday meal of New Orleans, and its origins were entirely practical. Monday was laundry day. You put the beans on in the morning, went about the heavy work of washing, and came back hours later to a pot that had been taking care of itself. For a senior, that same quality was the whole point. You started the pot at noon, rested, watched television, read, napped, and returned at 5 to a finished meal. No standing over the stove, no monitoring. The beans did their own work, and what they produced for less than $3 in ingredients was something so rich and thick and deeply flavored that you forgot entirely what it cost to make. Louis Armstrong closed his personal letters with, "Red beans and ricely yours." That was not irony. That was a man who carried the food of his earliest life with him everywhere he went. Number 4. Depression stew. This was the meal a retired steelworker in Pittsburgh made every night for 3 years. Ground beef browned in the bottom of a pot, a can of tomatoes, a can of corn, 2 diced potatoes, water, salt, and pepper. That was everything. As the potatoes cooked, their starch dissolved into the broth and thickened it without any effort on your part. The corn added sweetness. The tomatoes gave it an edge of acidity that kept it from feeling flat. And the ground beef, even the cheapest available from the discount case at the back of the store, gave the whole thing a substance that carried you through to the next morning. This recipe appeared in Depression-era cookbooks without a name, just stew. Women penciled it into the margins of other recipes. Mothers told daughters about it on their wedding days, quietly, like something you pass on because it matters. It was the recipe that said, whatever else is happening, you can eat tonight. For a senior on a fixed income, this stew was not just dinner. It was a form of refusal, a quiet insistence on staying upright. One pot lasted 4 days. One pot cost less than $5. One pot kept a man alive and independent until the age of 91. Number 3. Chicken thigh and rice pot. For decades, chicken thighs were the cut that budget-conscious cooks chose, while everyone else chased boneless, skinless breasts. Thighs cost half as much, and seniors who had been cooking long enough to know better bought them at 69 cents a pound and made something that tasted twice as good. You browned the thighs in the bottom of a pot, added a cup of rice, a can of chicken broth, and whatever seasoning was on the shelf. Then you covered the pot and let it go for 30 minutes. The rice absorbed every drop of the broth. The thighs, dark meated and tender, pulled apart at the touch of a fork. The fat in dark chicken meat was the entire secret. It kept the rice moist and gave the meat a succulence that white meat has never been able to match, no matter how you cook it. For a senior with a fading appetite, that richness made the difference between pushing food around a plate and actually finishing the meal. This was the dish that came out of a grandmother's kitchen automatically, the one that required no recipe and no measuring, and tasted exactly the same every time. Number 2. Pinto beans and cornbread. Technically, the cornbread required a skillet, but it was the same cast iron pan that had been used for 60 years, seasoned by use into something practically non-stick, and the beans simmered in the only other pot on the stove. A bag of dried pinto beans cooked low and slow for 3 hours with salt pork or a ham hock until the broth went thick and brown and the beans turned completely soft and creamy inside. The cornbread came out of the skillet golden and crackling and was broken into rough pieces and dropped into the bean broth to soak. Across the rural South, the Ozarks, and the Plains, this was not one meal among many. It was the meal, the one that defined poverty cooking for over a century. Pinto beans remain the cheapest protein source in the American grocery store from the Depression through today. A senior who kept a bag of dried pintos and a box of cornmeal in the cabinet was never going to go hungry. There was nothing to photograph about it, nothing to post or to brag about or to hashtag. There was only a full stomach and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow you could do exactly this again. Number 1. Chicken soup. A whole chicken in a pot of cold water with carrots, celery, onion, and salt. 2 hours of simmering at a low rumble until the house carried the smell of something ancient and right. The broth turned the color of late afternoon light. The chicken fell apart without being touched. The vegetables dissolved into softness. This was the most basic, most universal, most quietly powerful meal human beings have ever agreed on. Every culture has a version of it. Every generation has received it from the one before. For a senior living alone in a quiet house, a pot of chicken soup was not just nutrition. It was memory made edible. Every sick day someone had ever brought it to you. Every winter someone had left a pot on the stove with the lid slightly ajar. Every time in your life that someone had made it because they were worried about you and wanted you to feel that. When you make it for yourself, in a silent kitchen with no one waiting at the table, something of all of that still remains. The steam still rises from the bowl. The broth still warms from the inside out. And somewhere in the smell of it, you remember that your life is still worth the effort of cooking. Here is something worth sitting with. These meals cost almost nothing because they are built from ingredients that the food industry cannot profit from. Dried beans, potatoes, onions, rice, cabbage, canned tomatoes. There is no brand to build loyalty around in a bag of lentils. There is no advertising campaign possible for a head of cabbage. The profit margin on a can of navy beans is measured in pennies. That is exactly why you have never seen a commercial for any of these meals. That is why no celebrity chef builds a media career around potato and onion stew. The foods that have kept seniors alive, independent, and nourished for generations are the same foods that no corporation can figure out how to monetize. So instead, the industry sells frozen dinners at $4 a piece that contain less actual nutrition than a bowl of bean soup that costs 35 cents to make. The economics are not subtle. They are not accidental. They are just cruel. Here is what I want you to do this week. Pick one of these. Just one. The potato soup, the lentil stew, the chicken thigh and rice. Make it, and then do one more thing. Sit at the table, not the couch, not in front of the television. Set an actual place. Eat it slowly. Because these meals were never only about being inexpensive. They were about staying alive and staying human during the stretches of life when it would have been easy and understandable to stop trying. Tell me in the comments which one you are going to make. I want to know whether the Depression stew wins out over the pinto beans. I want to know if anyone else's grandmother had a signature like Louis Armstrong's. Because these are not just recipes. They are proof that the simplest food, made in a single pot, eaten alone at a kitchen table, can still be, every single time, an act of dignity.